You climbed a mountain, you bled for it. You sacrificed sleep, peace, love, friendships, maybe even parts of yourself that once made you human. And now you're standing at the summit, your name echoing off the cliffs of admiration, your victories printed on the banners of social approval. But in the silence that follows the applause, there is a void, a gnawing, hollow hum that no trophy can silence. You won, and yet you feel nothing. This is a lie they sold you success as salvation. That achievement would deliver you. That status would make you whole. That by conquering the world outside, you could finally quiet the storm within. But here's the truth. Winning is not the antidote to emptiness. In fact, if your identity was built on the pursuit of victory alone, then winning is the moment you lose everything. Because the mask falls off the moment the goal is reached, the armor rusts, the mission dissolves, and what's left is the question you've been running from since the beginning. Who are you without the chase? They never taught you how to stand still. They taught you how to conquer, not how to be at peace. They taught you how to impress, not how to be fulfilled. So you kept climbing. Higher titles, faster cars, more followers. Louder applause, thinking fulfillment was at the next milestone. But it never was. Because fulfillment isn't found in the future. It's forged in the furnace of presence. You see, the modern world raised you to be a machine optimized, productive, externally validated. But machines do not feel. They do not breathe. They do not wonder. And the moment you traded your soul for performance, you became a prisoner in golden chains. Even Carl Jung said it. People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own souls. So you became addicted to winning, not because you loved success, but because you feared stillness. Because silence might reveal the ache you buried beneath ambition. But now the noise is gone. The applause has faded, the spotlight moved on, and all you're left with is yourself. Can you sit with that? The emptiness you feel is not a defect, it is a signal. It is your psyche screaming to be reclaimed. It is your inner self, starving after a lifetime of being exiled. You mistook the climb for the calling, but the real ascent is inward. This is not depression. This is disorientation. You reach the summit of the wrong mountain. There is a hidden cost to external success. Disconnection from self. The more you shape-shift to earn approval, the more you lose access to your own soul. The more you perform for applause, the more you abandon the quiet voice within. And eventually, the body wins, but the spirit weeps. So, if you feel hollow after winning, it is because you played a game designed to make you feel that way. A game rigged to reward the mask, not the man. A culture that monetizes your insecurity, exploits your drive, and leaves you empty at the top so you'll keep playing. You were taught to ask, what can I achieve? Instead of, what do I need to become whole? You were taught to be admired, not to be known. You were taught to build your resume, not your character. And now it hurts. But that pain is a gift, because it's the first honest thing you've felt in years. It's the only part of you not pretending. The emptiness is the invitation, not to chase more, but to return to yourself, to your forgotten voice, to your unlived life. This is the turning point to sacred rupture. The moment when the persona cracks and the true self begins to emerge. Not the self that wins, but the self that wakes up. The self that is no longer willing to be a slave to performance. The self that would rather be whole than admired, alive than impressive, free than successful, because the soul does not care about your resume. It does not care about how many likes, promotions, or degrees you've collected. The soul is only interested in one question. Are you living in truth? You can win the world and still be starving for meaning, Because meaning does not come from the world. It comes from alignment. And alignment is not something you win it. It's something you remember. But remembering is a violent process. It tears down everything that is false. And for a while it feels like death, because in many ways it is. It is the death of the mask, the death of the persona you constructed to survive, the death of the achiever, the performer, the pleaser, and the rebirth of the human being underneath. This is the confrontation you've avoided your entire life. The mirror, not the mirror on Instagram, not the one made of glass, but the inner mirror, the one that reflects your essence, the one that doesn't care about your image, only your integrity. When you finally stand before it, naked of titles, stripped of identity, that's when the real work begins. That's when healing starts. Not with a therapist or a course or a guru boot, with the willingness to feel what you've buried. And yes, it will hurt, but it will also liberate you, because in that pain is your compass. In that emptiness is your map. It's showing you the difference between who you are and who you've become, between the truth you suppressed and the lie you wore like armor. And once you've seen it, you can't unsee it. That's the beginning of freedom. But it's also the beginning of solitude. Because once you stop performing, you lose the crowd. Once you stop chasing, you lose the momentum. And once you start feeling, you lose the numbness. But in losing all of that, you gain something rare. You gain yourself. You gain the capacity to feel joy without achievement. You gain the strength to stand alone without applause. You gain the clarity to say no to what no longer aligns. And for the first time, you feel real. Not perfect, not admired, but whole. And that wholeness, unlike victory, cannot be taken from you. It does not vanish after the goal is reached. It does not depend on external validation. It does not require sacrifice of self. It simply is. Because it's who you were before the world told you who to be. So now, the question is no longer, how do I win? The real question is, what part of me did I abandon to win? And is it time to go back for it? Because the deeper tragedy is not that you feel empty after winning. It's that you were full before you ever started. And you forgot. Not because you were foolish, but because the world is a master hypnotist. It whispers promises through screens and slogans and well-dressed idols. If you just keep going, if you keep grinding, if you keep optimizing, you will finally arrive. And so you ran faster, harder, breathless, through a maze of performance, chasing the mirage of enough. But enough never came, because enough was never out there. It was always the doorway back in. But in order to return, you must first grieve. Yes, grieve. Not just the years you lost chasing someone else's dream, but the version of you that had to die in order to survive. The child who was once enough simply by being. The artist who created without metrics. The lover who gave without calculating worth. The soul who danced with life not as a strategy, but as a sacred play. You buried them beneath your armor. You silenced them with ambition. You betrayed them every time you said yes when you meant no. Every time you smiled for the camera while your insides bled. And now they knock at the door of your awareness, asking not for revenge, but for remembrance. Because your emptiness is not your enemy. It is the evidence of everything you've forgotten. The smell of rain on childhood pavement. The taste of stillness in a world that never stops. The warmth of your own presence before you outsourced your worth to strangers. This is not about rejecting achievement. It's about awakening within it. It's about learning to win without losing yourself. Because the deeper lesson isn't that success is wrong. It's that success without self is suicide with applause. You were not born to be a band. You were not sculpted to be a spectacle. You were born to live, to feel, to create, to connect not as a means to status, but as an end in itself. But the tragedy is this. When being is not enough, you become addicted to doing. And when doing is not enough, you become addicted to winning. And when winning is not enough, you spiral into a quiet despair that no one sees, because the world only sees the highlight reel. They cheer for your accomplishments, unaware they were built on your disappearance. They envy your success, not knowing it cost you your soul. So you smile, you nod, you post a photo. But inside, you are gone. That is the real crisis, not the burnout, not the fatigue, not the stress. The real crisis is spiritual amnesia. You forgot who you are beneath the mask of achievement. And now the memory is calling, not in the language of words, but in the ache of your own emptiness. It is not asking you to quit. It is asking you to return, to recover the parts of yourself you exiled for excellence, to reclaim the inner sanctuary that was never for sale, to resurrect the soul that once found beauty in simplicity, presence in silence, and truth in stillness. But to return, you must unlearn. You must unlearn the belief that you are only as valuable as your results. You must unlearn the story that says your worth is in your productivity. You must unlearn the gospel of hustle that worships burnout as a badge of honor. Because all of that, every single ounce is a lie. A beautifully packaged, systemically reinforced, culturally approved lie. And the price of believing it is your life. Not in the physical sense, but in the soul deep sense, the part of you that feels, that breathes, that loves without reason. That part dies slowly in a life of performance, until one day you wake up surrounded by everything you once prayed for and realize you feel nothing. Because you didn't climb a mountain, you climbed a ladder, leaned against the wrong wall. But here's the miracle: emptiness is not the end. It is the threshold. It is the collapse before the rebirth. It is the sacred disillusionment that cracks your identity wide open and makes space for truth. Because something beautiful happens when the illusion finally breaks. You stop chasing and you start listening, not to the noise of the world, but to the whisper of your own soul. The whisper that says, you were never broken. You were just buried under expectations, under identities, under the pressure to prove your right to exist. But your existence needs no proof. You are not a project. You are not a brand. You are not a tool. You are a flame, and you were meant to burn wildly, freely, beautifully, not to light the world stage, but to illuminate your own path. So if you feel empty, honor it. Don't numb it. Don't outrun it. Don't shame it. Because in that emptiness is a doorway. And on the other side is everything real. But to step through that doorway, you must first allow the fire to consume what is false. The awakening is not a gentle process. It is not a peaceful yoga pose or a softly lit meditation retreat. It is a violent eruption of truth. It is the collapse of every identity you constructed to feel safe. It is the death of your false self, publicly celebrated, meticulously curated, socially approved, and the birth of something raw, unfiltered, and undeniably real. This is why most people never awaken, because the cost of truth is everything that isn't. And truth does not negotiate. It does not ask for permission. It arrives like a storm and says, everything you thought you were, let it burn. And in that burning there is pain, because now you feel. You feel the grief of all the years you wore the mask. You feel the sorrow of betraying your own voice to fit into someone else's script. You feel the rage of waking up in a life you built from fear instead of alignment. But that pain, pure, unfiltered, unmedicated, is sacred. It is your soul bleeding the poison. It is the detox from decades of delusion. It is the rage of a lion finally remembering it was never a pet. And as it roars, something ancient in you begins to stir. Not the part of you trained to smile and say you're fine. Not the part that calculates what's socially acceptable before speaking, but the part that remembers. The part that was never lost, only silenced. The wildness, the presence, the integrity, the clear knowing that your value has nothing to do with visibility, that your purpose has nothing to do with performance, that your worth is not a currency to be earned, it is a birthright to be remembered. And from this awakening comes change, not the kind that can be posted, marketed, or monetized, but the kind that rearranges you from the inside out. You start saying no without guilt. You start creating without craving approval. You start resting without feeling lazy. You start speaking with a voice that isn't trembling for permission, because something has shifted. The axis of your identity has moved. No longer spinning around others' expectations, you begin orbiting your own truth. And this terrifies people, because when you awaken, you become untamable. You're no longer predictable. You stop fitting in. You stop apologizing for being too much, too intense, too quiet, too deep, too slow. You stop playing small so others can feel comfortable in your presence. Because now your presence is no longer a performance, it is a transmission. A signal that says, I am not here to entertain, I am here to be real. And that is the most radical act in a culture addicted to illusion. You become immune to manipulation. Not because you built walls, but because you no longer need validation. You no longer chase approval because you found something stronger congruence. You no longer sacrifice peace for progress because you've realized the ultimate success is not achievement but alignment. And in that alignment, life begins to soften. Not because it gets easier, but because it gets truer. The choices you make now carry a different weight. They are not driven by fear, but by clarity. They're not made to impress, but to express. You stop chasing goals just to prove you're enough. You start choosing paths that allow your soul to breathe. You move slower, but more intentionally. You speak less, but more powerfully. You seek less attention, but more connection. Because you're no longer seeking to be seen, you're seeking to be known. You're no longer addicted to doing, you're rooted in being. And that changes everything. Because now, you're no longer operating from lack. You're moving from fullness, from enoughness, from the quiet confidence that comes, not from achievement, but from authenticity. And that authenticity, unpolished, imperfect, unfiltered aid is magnetic. It doesn't scream, it doesn't hustle, it doesn't beg. It simply exists, like a mountain, like a flame, like a truth that cannot be denied. And suddenly, life responds differently. Opportunities align. People shift. Doors open not because you forced them, but because you finally became congruent with who you really are. You stop attracting what you want and start receiving what matches your essence. Because the universe doesn't respond to what you say you want, it responds to who you are being. And when you are being truth, life bends to meet you in ways the mind could never plan. This is the alchemy of awakening. It is not found in books. It is not earned through hustle. It is born through fire. The fire of feeling. The fire of remembering. The fire of unbecoming everything that isn't you. And as the ashes settle, you stand not as a brand, not as a performer, not as a projection, but as a human being real, whole, and finally home. And so, here you are, not at the end, But at the threshold, the world told you that success was the summit, that glory was the destination, that if you could just achieve enough, impress enough, accumulate enough, you would finally feel enough. But now you know. The peak was never the point. The point was to wake up, to remember that you were never here to play a role. You were here to live a revolution, not out there, but in here, in your breath, in your truth, in your bare, unbranded existence. Because what the world calls empty is just unclaimed space. It's the room you finally made by burning the mask. It's the silence after the storm where the real voice can finally speak. And it says this: you were never meant to perform your way into worth. You were meant to embody it, to walk through this life not as a resume, not as a product, not as a profile, but as a presence. This is not a breakdown. This is a breaking open. This is not where it ends. This is where you begin. Not the version of you that smiles through pain, not the version that bows to applause, but the version that stands alone if needed, true at all costs. The world will try to sell you new leathers. It will try to rebrand your cage with better lighting. It will dress your shackles in designer labels. But you've seen behind the curtain now. You felt the ache that cannot be numbed. You've heard the whisper beneath the noise. You've looked in the mirror not to admire, but to meet yourself. And from this place, you will build not a performance, but a life. Not a persona, but a truth. Not a monument to approval, but a sanctuary of integrity. Because from here, you are no longer chasing success. You are defining it. You are rewriting the contract. Not one that demands your soul in exchange for validation, but one that says, I will not abandon myself to be loved. I will not betray my truth to be accepted. I will not dim my fire to keep others comfortable. I will burn bright, bold, and untamed. Not to be famous, but to be free. And in that freedom, you become something unstoppable. Not because of what you achieve, but because of what you embody. Realness, wholeness, presence, power. Because at the end of all your striving, the only thing that ever truly mattered was whether you remembered who you were before the world told you who to be. And now you do. So walk forward not as a winner who feels empty, but as a soul who is finally full. Not full of noise, but full of truth. And that truth, it cannot be taken. It cannot be marketed. It cannot be sold, because it was never earned. It was always yours.